Hello and welcome to our Christian Literary Imagination series. This is the 13th event in that series, which is sponsored by Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative in association with the Las Casas Institute, Blackfriars Hall, the University of Oxford, and Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. Today I'll be welcoming Dr. Jane Stevenson, who'll be talking about Marguerite Radcliffe Hall, also known as John Radcliffe Hall. After her talk, I will take questions submitted from the members of the audience, which is internationally based. I encourage you to participate by typing your questions directly to us from the moment we begin the session. You can do so by using your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question or questions, please ask them, and we will endeavour to answer them, either today or later by email. Jane Stevenson is a senior fellow at Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. She was educated at Cambridge and has taught at Cambridge, at Sheffield, Warwick, and Aberdeen universities. She is published widely, both in articles and books, and is a literary and an historic history scholar. And she's a novelist. Currently, she's working on a biography of Federico del Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino. You may know him best, perhaps, by the famous profile portrait by Piero della Francesca with the red hat and the rather large crooked nose. Today's talk is entitled Catholicism and Queerness in Interwar England. And I'm delighted to welcome Jane Stevenson. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. One of the aspects of artistic life in England between the wars, which has often surprised people, is how many homosexuals converted to Catholicism. In her most famous book, The Well of Loneliness, Radcliffe Hall poses a rhetorical question. What of that curious craving for a religion, which so often went hand in hand with inversion? Her whole book is an answer to that question. The conversion of gay people like Oscar Wilde and Ronald Furbank is often associated in a rather simplistic way with the ritualistic and aesthetic elements of the Catholic tradition. Incense, altar boys, music, all that stuff. But of course, there's more to it than that. It might also be to do with Catholicism's inclusivity, as we shall see this is particularly true in interwar France. A French novelist, Barbé d'Aurevilly, wrote in 1920, "What is mentally magnificent about Catholicism is that it is wide, comprehensive, and unbounded, embracing human nature whole. It unfurls still the great maxim, woe to him that taketh scandal." As Oscar Wilde wryly said, the Catholic Church is for saints and sinners alone. For respectable people, the Anglican Church will do. And of course, there's also sacerdotalism to take into account, that the Catholic tradition offers sacraments of penitence and absolution. Hall is only one of a number of lesbian writers in the early 20th century who were converts, and they included two of her lovers, Mabel Batten and Una Troubridge, and quite a few of her friends. Well, while airy formulation may contain a germ of truth, there were specific reasons why interwar homosexuals were drawn to Catholicism. Pope Leo XIII's encyclical letter Aeterni Patris argues that modern social and political problems can be remedied by returning to the theology of Thomas Aquinas. Amongst the chief principle of neo-Thomism in the 20th century was the common good as a measure of political order. Jacques Maritain was one of the most influential of neo-Thomists, and he wrote, "No one more than Thomas has emphasized the primacy of the common good." Hall was herself very concerned with social justice, not only with justice for lesbians. In 1929, she sold her Sargent portrait of her first love, Mabel Batten, on behalf of striking minors. Mentioning Maritain is a reminder that 20s France was the scene of a remarkable Catholic Renaissance, in which a variety of public intellectuals converted to Catholicism and initiated a dialogue between Catholicism and modernism. At the same time, 20s Paris was the center of an international lesbian community, principally British and American, connected in complex ways with the arts. and this was because it was possible to live an openly lesbian life in Paris. Hall was friends with Natalie Barnett, who was one of the central figures of this world, and through her met many others. At the same time, a variety of Hall's Catholic contemporaries in France were interested in outcasts and the marginalized, notably the novelist Léon Bloy and the painter Georges Rouault. The Christ to whom Radcliffe Hall was drawn was above all the Christ who suffered, who was resistant to religious and social authority, always on the side of the social outcast, a model of compassion and justice. A Christ who was mocked, scorned, despised, shamed, and forsaken, something which a gay person in the 1920s could understand only too well. For queer Catholics, the suffering of Christ gave a context for experiencing, understanding, and giving dignity to the social suffering which was associated with sexual nonconformity in the 1920s. Hall's novels focus principally on three themes: the destructive effect on parenting, which pays no attention to the child's specific nature, the position of women, and the imitation of Christ. All her novels are suffused with a preoccupation with spiritual self-knowledge, which is acquired through suffering and self-denial. Before The Well of Loneliness was published in 1928, her readership would have seen her either as a feminist writer or a Christian one, or both. And though to our eyes her very short hair, her masculine jackets have a story to tell, before she took the very courageous decision to out herself in 1928, her readers did not realize she was sexually unorthodox. To contemporaries, she just looked fashionable and modern. Ethel Mannin recalls that in the mid-20s, the most heterosexual of women might appear in severely tailored suits worn with shirts and ties. It was the fashion. Hall's first novel was called The Unlit Lamp and introduced the key themes of bad mothering and that using one's talents is an imperative. The book has a protagonist called Joan, a failed Joan of Arc, potentially brilliant, who allows herself to be trapped by her mother's emotional neediness. Her dream is to become a doctor, which Hall presents as chivalric self-dedication. Most notably in the exchange between Joan and her closest male friends, who asks her, "Have you prayed over your sword?" And she knew what he meant. "No," she said, "I haven't had the courage to unsheath it." Unrealized love and unused talent are central to Hall's intention in this novel. Her second, her most critically successful, was Adam's Breed in 1926, about a second-generation Anglo-Italian in Soho, brought up by his grandmother, who hates him. Age 14, he becomes a waiter, and his employer soon discovers he has an instinct for perfect service. When World War I breaks out, his illegitimacy debars him from serving in the Italian army. He joins the British, hoping to fight, but finds he's assigned to the service corps, looking after an officer's mess back at the base. So, like Hall's female heroes, his desire for heroic male action is sidelined and trivialized. After the end of the war, he goes back to his job as head waiter, but has been disoriented by his war experience. Ultimately, his only solution is to renounce the world and become a homeless pilgrim, dying alone in the New Forest, aged only 34. There were many traumatized men in the aftermath of the First World War, so this book resonated with its public. It sold very well, was critically acclaimed, and won both the Prix Femina and the James Tait Black Prize. The next book, of course, was The Well of Loneliness, which, like the one before it, invokes World War I as a crucible for personal change. While male writers emphasized the cruel futility of the war, it had a special significance for women who were dissatisfied with traditional gender roles. It gave them a chance. Hall's circle of friends included the redoubtable Tupi Lowther. She spoke excellent French. She was a champion fencer, an international tennis player, and above all, an expert driver. So she was one of 25,000 British and American women who joined volunteer relief organizations in France during the Great War. Quite a few of these were lesbians. Jo Carstairs, the racing driver, later first experienced liberation from family control by going to France in 1916 to drive an ambulance. Between runs to the trenches, she shared a flat in Montparnasse with several other women, one of whom was Oscar Wilde's lesbian niece, Dolly, who became her lover. It was war service which gave women like Jo Carstairs and Tupi Lowther dignity, an escape from the petty and trivial lives forced on unmarried middle and upper class women. Now, Tupi Lowther put her talents to use by organising an all-female team of women ambulance drivers. 20 cars, 25 to 30 drivers attached to the 2nd Army Corps of the French 3rd Army. The work was unrelentingly hard and dangerous. There's a novel by one Evadne Price, which was based on the diaries of a woman ambulance driver called Winifred Young. Price, or perhaps Young, summed up the experience: wounds and foul smells and smutty stories and smoke and bombs and lice and filth, noise, 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 cold, sick fear, a dirty world of darkness and despair. Not the least of the horrors, of course, was picking up men barely recognizable as human beings. And of course, there was always the risk of being shelled or pitched into a shell hole, car and all. Now, Tupi Lowther's unit served with tremendous bravery and effectiveness. Several members, including Lowther, were awarded the Croix de Guerre. After the war, she became friendly with Hall and her lover Una Troubridge and taught them to drive. And it's clear that her wartime career made a great impression on Hall, because she drew on Lowther's experience in both a short story and in The Well of Loneliness. Both of them place the protagonist in a version of Lowther's ambulance unit. Both of them are about a woman whose only opportunity for recognizing her true identity, a masculine soul in a female body, was the Great War. Like Tupi Lowther, Stephen Gordon in The Well of Loneliness is a fencer and motorist. She serves in an ambulance unit at Compiègne and is awarded the Croix de Guerre. So as Hall tried to plot a novel which would dramatize the plight of sexual nonconformists in a hostile world, it was Tupi Lowther who gave her the model she needed. Her war service gave Hall the material to create a sexually dissident protagonist whose heroic actions should by rights have earned her the respect of society. Hall says of her fictionalized version of the ambulance corps, war and death had given them a right to life. She passes rather lightly over the genuine horror of the work and focuses rather on camaraderie. But she calls her fictional corps the Breakspear unit, a strong hint that the hero should perceive the women's service in the light of medieval chivalry. Lesbians, of course, have been very uncomfortable with The Well of Loneliness. When Hall's biography came out, a reviewer in the Gay Times wrote that Hall must have done the single greatest disservice to the lesbian cause since Adam. Now, today's classifications of gender dysphoria might allow us to ask whether Hall actually was a lesbian or was in fact transsexual in an era that hadn't evolved the concept. And that she drew Stephen Gordon in her own image and that of Tupi Lowther, in which case she probably wasn't talking about lesbians at all. Though it is worth observing minor characters of the novel include a version of Natalie Barney, who is patently having a perfectly satisfactory life amongst a like-minded community. Stephen, though, is lonely in a way that her author wasn't. Radcliffe Hall was never without at least one girlfriend from her 20s onwards. She successfully made her life with a succession of women. She had dozens of gay friends, successful personally and professionally, including Noel Coward. But Stephen is lonely. She has one brief relationship with another woman whom she renounces on the grounds that she was capable of living a heterosexual life. So it's easy to see why this plot has irritated lesbians. But it has a very clear religious dimension. Stephen has to suffer because she is being represented as a suffering servant. Hall may very well have encountered the works of a French novelist, Léon Bloy. who used his fiction to offer a model of suffering as a privileged mode of redemption, focusing on prostitutes and Jews. The first should be last and the last first. Hall was poorly educated, but her partner, Lady Troubridge, was a distinguished literary translator from French. The structure of The Well of Loneliness suggests strongly that Hall had either come across Bloy's work or had independently evolved a similar theology, which applied Bloy's perceptions to sexual nonconformists. She may also, through Lady Troubridge, have become aware of Jacques Maritain, who developed a specific sense of mission to homosexuals. Essential to Hall's thinking is the idea that homosexuality or intersexuality isn't a choice. She arrived at this conclusion from studying Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis. Science had pronounced, she thought, there was such a thing as a congenital invert. Therefore, as a Christian, it followed that God had chosen to make women like her for his own purposes, and consequently her existence and her desires could be neither a mistake nor a sin. The purpose she divined for herself was to use the public recognition which she had won as a novelist in order to bear witness to her gay brothers and sisters, accepting that the result would be a kind of martyrdom, as indeed it was. Another book which may have influenced her thinking is Maritain's Art and Scholasticism, first published in 1920, which promoted the idea of the artist as a chivalrous knight, serving a cause larger than himself, a vision which Hall would have found potent. In The Well of Loneliness, the protagonist Stephen Gordon is born on Christmas Eve, named after the proto-martyr. She has a strong instinct for self-sacrifice. She perceives herself as a man in a woman's body, but she longs to serve, to use her capacity on others' behalf, a desire which is finally gratified by going to France as an ambulance driver. This career, of course, allows Hall to combine the male chivalric idea of knighthood in the Breakspear unit, the service of the weak by the strong, with feminine ideas of nurture and protection. So The Well effectively portrays a lesbian messiah, uniting sexological and religious perceptions. Stephen, after a lifetime of suffering, sees herself as in some way called to proclaim the existence of her people and to sacrifice herself, as did her creator. The whole implication of the narrative is that, like Hall, she will use her public platform to present the argument for homosexuals as the children of God. Her sexual life suggests her exemplary status. A single relationship does not break down for lack of love. It is entered on by virginal women utterly committed to each other, but because Stephen comes to believe Mary will fundamentally be happier if she does not have to live as an outcast, she selflessly pushes her into the arms of a man by pretending to have an affair. Stephen's renunciation of Mary is necessary to Hall's narrative as a parallel to Christ's abandonment by his disciples at Calvary. It has to occur so the full devastation of the passion can be experienced. Only then will recuperation be possible. Once Mary has gone, Stephen, in her lonely agony, finds herself gradually possessed by legions of inverts from throughout time, living dead and unborn. They beg her to speak with God for them, and then they possess her. She speaks for queer people from past, present, and future, giving passionate voice to their collective prayer. God, she gasped, we believe. We have told you we believe. We have not denied you. Then rise up and defend us. Acknowledge us, O God, before the whole world. Give us also the right to our existence. It is only in this moment of prophetic frenzy that Stephen becomes a whole human being, since she suddenly experiences the femininity she has always attempted to deny. Her epiphany is experienced in terms of giving birth. She experiences her mighty striving for a better world as a kind of physical labor. What she is embracing is the idea of becoming the conduit of a better future. And thus, as in her days as an ambulance driver, she is simultaneously a heroic knight and a nurturing mother. So thank you very much, and over to you. Michael?
I'm back. Just a little technical hitch there, but never mind. That's all right. I'm back. Well, thank you, Jane, for that lovely discussion paper. We have a question in straight away from Fernando Herrero Gomez. Hello, Fernando. Good to hear from you again. And he writes this: Catholicism and queerness in 20th century England, we should imagine, I suppose, as a minority cultures largely elite, literary and artistic. Please, could you make some connections with your Baroque between the Wars book? Why the English repudiation of the nomenclature of the Baroque is still operative today in England? Is it because of its connection with the Roman Church, its elite character, its forgiveness? Many thanks.
Gosh, well, that's a complicated question.
It is a bit, yes.
Yes. First of all, you're absolutely correct. The sort of homosexual Catholic conversion narratives are metropolitan. I mean, they're essentially about people who spend at least some of their time in London. They're elite, and they're very much sort of people who are involved with the arts. So that, I mean, that's absolutely true. Baroque between the wars, I mean, I don't want to talk about much because other listeners may not be at all familiar with this book of mine, but I think, yes, it is possibly the strong association between Baroque and Catholicism, which at least contributes to English nervousness with the concept of Baroque. But I do argue in my book that one of the things about Baroque is not that it's elitist, but actually that it's rather more encompassing and universal than is modernism. So I'm afraid that is a short answer to a long question, but I hope it's the main point.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I just wonder about that, the between the war years. These are very strange years, aren't they, historically, in terms of coming out from a war which had been caused by the ruling classes arguing with each other, vying with each other, which had got into a situation whereby people were frankly just slaughtered. And then we move in to a period moving towards economic catastrophe, the rise of right-wing Nazism, fanaticism that is going on. So that for the artists of that period, it was incredibly difficult and challenging in terms of the work they were to do. They wanted to do according to what they wanted to express. And I realized that in your paper, you talk about the way in which Radcliffe had, in a sense, benefited from the war, as many women did, because they were given a dignity of having a role to play. But do you think that with Radcliffe Hall, there was also a reaction towards war and towards what had happened?
Well, I think, whereas male writers like, say, Wilfred Owen, I mean, see, the sort of horrors of the trenches, I mean, as just a sort of unmitigated human disaster. I think what I found fascinating was that for people like Tupilautha, the war was actually their only chance. It was the best thing that ever happened to them, which is, a strange and paradoxical thought. But I think one aspect of this is that in the post-war period, the sexual dissidence becomes a very major topic, partly because the place is full of masculinized women and feminized men. I mean, men who have been feminized, so to say, by shell shock, and women who, whether gay or not, have accustomed themselves to stepping up into male roles in one way or another. That they work like men, they've learned to drive, they've done all kinds of things. So the sense that sexual roles and sexual identity was something that really needed to be questioned and thought about is very much a feature of the arts of the 1920s, I think. And to which I think you can add that many writers are suffering from something which is recognizably sort of survivor guilt. You know, the best ones fell, where the sort of relics that are still there, and then the sort of hedonism of the 20s is a reaction to that. You know, where did all that chivalry and I vow to thee my country get everybody? Yeah, you know, yeah. It got them dead. That's what it got them. So for a woman like Hall, who actually didn't herself serve in the war, but clearly rather envied those who had, her response to war and to the culture is a peculiarly rich one.
Yes, it reminds me there of Shakespeare in Falstaff in Henry IV asking, what is honour? You know, does honour mend a leg? You know, does honour bring you back to life? There's a question here coming in. It said, I'm interested in the development of lesbian identity categories over time. 18th century historians have argued that although there was homosexual behavior in that period, the identity, sorry, I've just lost that. The identity categories we associate with this today were not acknowledged. I wonder if you could speak to the development of these categories in association with Catholicism, particularly in the 20th century.
Yes. I think it was Laura Doan who pointed out that Anne Lister, who's probably the most famous 18th century lesbian, didn't appear to have a sense of herself and her girlfriends as belonging in a particular category. I think I think it might be, well, so go back one moment. I think we have a problem with looking at Radcliffe Hall as a lesbian. I mean, she was, gender dysphoric, you might say. I mean, but her conviction that she was a man in a woman's body would not in our world make her a lesbian. I mean, there are plenty of lesbians you can find in the 1920s. I'd have said it is Paris where you sort of most see a developed lesbian identity in the world of people like Natalie Barney and Romaine Brooks, who have, who are perfectly happy in their skins as lesbians and very willing to acknowledge their passionate affairs with other women. But of course, in Paris, you could do that. You couldn't do it in London. But Hall, I mean, I think Hall is effectively trans rather than lesbian, as was Tupi Lauda. But the vocabulary that she got from people like Havelock Ellis rather forced that upon you. I mean, she always uses the word invert. And an invert is something that's been turned upside down. I mean, so you get the man in a woman's body. So all homosexual men are effeminate and all homosexual women are masculine, which of course is complete nonsense. But I mean, look at Lady Una Troubridge, who was very, very feminine in her self-presentation. What Catholicism has to do with it? I think you might answer that to say that the sort of thinking about lesbianism is to a great extent happening in Paris, where there is simultaneously a sort of Catholic Renaissance going on. So the fact that people like Maritain are thinking about what it means to be homosexual by talking to homosexuals. I mean, his correspondence with Cocteau, for instance, was published where they were sort of arguing about these questions. So the sort of theological theorizing of homosexual identity is something which is going on in 1920s Paris. So perhaps not a very good answer to the question, but I think, you know, there is a Catholic dimension to the thinking that's going on, partly just because two worlds collide.
But that leads neatly, however, to another question coming in from Tony Eade, who says, hello, Tony. Thank you for sending a question. You're a great supporter of this series. What was the response of those in authority in the Catholic Church in France to the trends you describe, and especially to the well of loneliness?
I don't know. Some thinkers, I mean, like Maritain seem to be, you know, wholly acceptable as sort of neo-Thomists. Back in England, I mean, George Tyrrell was thinking about this stuff, particularly in conversation with Andrei Raffalovich, but he ended up being excommunicated and tossed out of the Jesuits. So, you know, I would have thought the hierarchies, or ultimately, you know, retained a conservative position, but they don't seem to have been necessarily interested in preventing debate. So yeah, I just don't know enough about Catholic history to answer that. I mean, I'm sort of working, you know, with one sort of specific thread. And as far as reaction to the Well of Loneliness, they simply didn't react to it. I mean, it was published. It wasn't published in French, you see. I mean, it was published in London. The trials of the Well of Loneliness took place in London and in America. So, you know, I don't think anybody sort of bothered to stick it on the index. It was a, you know, purely sort of Anglophone problem.
Yes. Yeah, I won't make a comment about that. But Paul Edmondson, hi Paul. It's interesting to hear your paper on the day the government in the UK has named in the Queen's speech the end of conversion therapy. Was this practice something that Hall wrote about, perhaps in the light of the religious conversion of queer people? Has the Roman Catholics' view of conversion therapy developed over the last century? How does the Roman Catholic Church view Hall? Again, as you said, you might be a little uncertain about the particularities of Catholic history, but do you want to have a go at that one?
Yes, well, in a sense, you could say that the Well of Loneliness engages with conversion therapy because, you know, for purely selfless reasons, Stephen Gordon, in effect, sort of enforces conversion therapy upon her lover, Mary. You know, by engineering a situation in which she marries a man, and you know, you just have to hope she's happy ever after. But sorry, I have a cat. I don't anymore. But I mean, Hall would have been absolutely horrified by the notion of conversion therapy in most contexts. I mean, her whole sort of platform that she's arguing in the Well of Loneliness is that your gender identity, your sexual identity, is an absolutely necessary part of your overall integrity as a human being, and put there by God. You know, she believes that with a passion. So, you know, conversion therapy, as you know, applied in more recent times, she'd have regarded as a form of torture or brainwashing. You know, despite the story of Stephen and Mary. I mean, her integrity, the necessity of being your whole self was, you know, absolutely key. I mean, that's what the Well of Loneliness is about. That you know, that homosexuals are being forced to deny their full humanity.
Yes, I think Fernando Hero Gomez comments Why would Catholicism be more welcoming of attractive per se to these queer Anglos in Paris? Are they expatriates against the plainer Church of England's tradition? Fascinating insight into the combination of theology and queerness, he comments. Joe Simmons, SJ, the co-convener of this series. Thanks, Joe. He says, thank you for an engaging presentation, Jane. It strikes me that Catholicism, an outsider religion in England, would have some appeal to those who themselves felt outside the normal. My mind goes to the outsized characters in A Bride's Head Revisited.
Yes, well, I mean, Richard de la Mora would argue that very strongly. I think, you know, that's true, but in a way, what when you've got one set of problems, why dump another lot on your head? There's, people aren't running around London in the 1920s converting to Judaism, let's say. It's Catholicism is exercising some kind of powerful, attractive force on on the sexually dissident. And I think the best idea that anybody has come up with is that in this particular historical moment in the 1920s, there is this strong argument in France for a Catholicism that is profoundly concerned with the outcast and the marginalized. And the novelist Léon Bloy was very, very influential, and a lot of people were converted by reading his stuff. But it's the fact that this is similar. The writings of Léon Bloy, this sort of social Catholic thinking is happening in France, in Paris, simultaneously with the creation of the world's first recognizable lesbian community. There's inevitable bleed through because people are talking to each other. So the ideas developed in connection with, say, Jews and prostitutes by people like Georges Rouault and Bloy are reconfigured in terms of sexual dissidence, of the idea of the Christ as suffering servant and an attraction to that. So that's not part of the Anglican tradition in any very obvious way that I can think of. Certainly not in the sort of Anglicanism of the 1920s, which is pretty sort of normative. So it's all about a church that is thoroughly integrated into society exactly as it is, whereas Catholicism has this end of sort of wildness and siding with the underdog. So I think this is a very positive thing that is going on.
I seem to recall there was a caricature of Radcliffe Hall which showed her with nails. It's by Pierce Egan. It shows her crucified. Yeah, and it's a mocking response. I mean, it's a mocking response to the claim she's making through Stephen in the Well of Loneliness. You're just it's saying essentially you're just a self-pitying silly woman who is presenting her vices with a dignity that they do not possess. I mean, that's what the drawing is saying. I mean, Hall's reaction, she did her level best to get the cartoonist in question prosecuted for blasphemy. I mean, she was upset on her own account, but what she was more upset about really was the insult to religion which it implied, as well as of course to the complete rejection of the message he was trying to put over. Very interesting. Muriel Bradbrook defined an icon as expressing the fears and aspirations of a society. Would you define Radcliffe Hall's placing of a crucifix, which had been blessed by the Pope, on the embalmed body of Mabel Batten? Was that a deliberate, iconic act that she wanted to show something to the world?
Well, I didn't think so, because the world didn't really know anything about it. Hall was self-dramatizing. I mean, she was a woman given to theatrical gesture. And she was also riddled with guilt at Mabel's death, because she feared that Mabel's final stroke had been triggered by a sizable row that they'd had earlier that very evening. So I think I think that is a purely private gesture of atonement, if you like, or the sharing of a symbol important to them both. I mean, that they had been received in a papal audience, possibly even a superstitious gesture. Having sort of sent Mabel on her long journey, at least in the guilty end of her mind, she could also with this crucifix give her as much protection as possible. So I don't think it's an iconic gesture as such. I think it's private and to do with the rather sort of tortuous quality of the end of their relationship.
Right. Do you think that she knew or had any indication from her writing that this would go on, that in the next century we might still be talking about it? Do you think she had that kind of foresight?
Well, I think she hoped passionately that her books, and that book above all, would be a catalyst towards a better world. And in some ways, I think she was. I mean, at the point when The Well of Loneliness was published, the majority of English people had no idea there was such a thing as lesbianism. And Leonard Woolf recalls his old mother saying, "I'm 73 and I've never heard about this." So the world of 1928 was familiar with the idea of gay men because of the Oscar Wilde trial. By deliberately sort of putting herself on the line as she did in the trial of The Well of Loneliness, she gave a face and a name to lesbianism, which allowed perhaps a significant number of women to say, "Oh gosh, is that what I am?" It raised the possibility of lesbianism, not just in sort of upper class metropolitan London, because the trials reported in newspapers throughout the English-speaking world. I mean, possibly also to sort of factory girls in Leeds. The novel opened the way to self-understanding, and I think she might well have hoped that people would stop reading it because it would no longer be necessary to read it. But the important thing was that it should do something. And I think, in effect, yes, it did.
Yes, and Leeds, of course, in the UK with other writers, D.H. Lawrence in particular, but John Osborne and others, to the end of censorship in the 1960s after the Lady Chatterley trial. Michael Collins from Georgetown. Hi, Mike. Good to hear from you. And he says, at the same time, Catholic Europe would prove itself sympathetic to fascist movements. What do you make of what seems a contradiction in the Catholic position?
Well, Catholicism is big enough to contain many mansions. And yes, I mean, obviously, there was a very right-wing Catholicism being argued for. At the same time, Catholicism has always there's always been this sort of voice from below, as it were. I mean, sort of like Francis of Assisi, and so Hall is I think involved with one particular strand in sort of Catholic thinking and Catholic experience, but in others, she's often quite she's socially conservative. I mean, in many respects, she was extremely conventional, but her passionate identification with suffering, all kinds of she was a pillar of the sort of prevention of cruelty to animals societies and all that kind of thing. And she cared about suffering, and she saw it in a religious context. So she would certainly have had no sympathy with fascism. And there was, there were a lot of Catholic intellectuals who would share that, who would have shared that view.
Who really influenced her in a Catholicism? Because she actually had a rather tragic childhood, didn't she? A sad childhood, difficult childhood.
Yeah.
Who brought that influence of Catholicism through with her? Do you know?
Yeah, Mabel Batten.
Oh, right.
Mother.
Yeah.
It was Mabel who converted first, and sort of pulled Radcliffe Hall in after her.
And was Mabel influenced by a particular Catholic thinker, or?
Well, I know she went to the Brompton Oratory.
Oh, right.
So right. That would be her. I think her natural point of recourse.
Well, that would have been the Newman tradition coming through.
Yeah.
I would imagine on that. From Paul Williams coming in. Hi, Paul. Can very much see the connections Jane is referring to with Catholicism and penance, exclusion, chivalry service. Did guilt, that well-known Catholic virtue in inverted commas, play a part in the development of the people, artists Jane has spoken about?
I don't think so particularly. Radcliffe Hall's lingering sense of guilt over the death of Mabel Batten, I think, was expressed through her spiritualist style. I mean, Hall was, Hall was also a believer in spiritualism, and her Catholicism was frankly a little eccentric. But she sort of exorcised her guilt by forcing herself to believe that sort of Mabel was still in touch with her and approved of her life and her new relationship with a much younger woman, and that she, Mabel, was happy and all the rest of it. I mean, that so she kind of talks herself out of her guilt, if you see what I mean. And as far as I can think of the other converts I can think of, they certainly don't feel guilty about their sexual identity, and it's rather more a sense of God made us and this is how he likes us.
Fernando's come back again. Should we make the connection between queer Catholic with English eccentricity in the good sense of the word? Would it be politically, socially conservative, a kind of Rees-Mogg early in the 20th century, or would it go in other left-wing directions? I think any direction from Rees-Mogg must be left, but left wing.
Yeah. Well, so she did she did sell her portrait of Mabel Batten to support striking miners.
Yeah.
So you can't say she's entirely a sort of feminized John Bull. I mean, her social tendencies were mostly conservative, except that, you know, she retained this belief in the right of people to be themselves, which is not generally a very sort of fascist position.
How widely read do you think she is now? I understand from Catherine that she's widely read at Georgetown and in the US. Is she widely read, do you think, at British universities and further afield?
I think she'd turn up as a sort of necessary text in just about any course that involved ideas about sexual dissidence. What she wouldn't turn up in, say, is a course on modernism and the novel, in terms of style of presentation and so forth. So she's far more in a tradition with people like Ford Madox Ford, and you know, the sort of continuing humdrum realist novel, which actually constituted most of the fiction being sold in the 1920s, rather than the sort of experimental fiction that she had no time for Bloomsbury writers like Virginia Woolf, no time for the Sitwells. I mean, that was all meretricious nonsense as far as she was concerned. She liked a good story. I mean, she thought you ought to tell a good story and do it properly in a realistic fashion. And so yes, I mean, she's part of the history of thought, you might say, part of the history of sexuality. She's not really part of the history of the novel.
Joe Simmons comes back and he says, fascinating to hear that Hall also dabbled in spiritualism. Do you see any affinities between the exoticisms of spiritualism and of early 20th century Catholicism?
I think, I mean, spiritualism was really sort of very much sort of wafting about in the world of the early 20s because of the First World War. So many people had lost somebody. So many people were just desperate to make contact with a beloved son, beloved father, whatever. So what had been a very minor and, you know, eccentric movement became surprisingly mainstream. And, you know, a whole lot of clever and influential people, and people like Rudyard Kipling were taking and Arthur Conan Doyle were taking interest in spiritualism, basically about a personal bereavement. So, you know, I don't, you know, we might perceive spiritualism as fairly eccentric phenomenon now, but that would not have been the case, you know, when Hall and Conan Doyle were sort of trying to summon up their beloved dead. And what Catholicism did for them, of course, was you know, allow for a conviction of being reunited. There's a lesbian pair who wrote collectively under the name of Michael Field. They'd converted to Catholicism to ensure that they would always be together. It's, you know, we were talking about post-war trauma earlier on, and I think this is another aspect of just the sort of pall of death which hung over the world in the, you know, after 1918.
And often forgotten by the politicians, by the history books, but that's a very, very important point. The nature of grief, the depth of grief, which was a communal depth across Europe, not just across England, across Europe. It was a European catastrophe. Paul Edmondson, and this will be the last question. Paul Edmondson says, one more if I may. I've often wondered what lessons were learned from the trial of the Well of Loneliness as we look ahead, as it were, to the trial of Lady Chatterley's lover. Was that trial an influence on the later trial? And we touched on it before a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I think both trials, witness to an important fact about the 20th century, which is the genie was out of the bottle, as it were. I mean, the capacity of a state to control things it didn't want people to read was extremely limited. I mean, the trial is one kind of a hurrah about sexual dissidence in after the Oscar Wilde trial, opening up the world of lesbian women, and then what happens, of course, is that Well gets pirated in France. People are smuggling copies back to England in their luggage. The world, in fact, even long before the internet, long before any of the things we take for granted, the world was already beginning to join up by 1928 to the point where state repression in the West was no longer really possible. And so again, the Chatterley trial relates to issues of obscenity and the right of the state to define what constitutes obscenity, and it doesn't work.
Jane, I'm going to draw it to a close there. I think it's been a fascinating talk, and the response, the questions, and your answers to the questions have been very thoughtful. I'm very grateful to you for it. Can I remind people that the next talk in this series will be on the 1st of June, but the speaker, unfortunately, due to the COVID crisis, has had to withdraw. So we've got something rather special coming up on the 1st of June, when Mary Ann Clark will be reading and discussing some of her poetry with me. She may be known to you as Molly Clark from Merton College, Oxford, because she gave that wonderful talk on Christopher Smart and his cat, of course, earlier in this series. So that's a real special treat on the 1st of June. And I can say that the person who's withdrawn will be talking later in next year's series. On Thursday, the 20th of May, we have an event teaming up with the Free Speech Project at Georgetown, when we'll be asking the panel the question, who speaks for the refugees? Such an important issue at the present time. This will be an international Zoom event, and we have some very, very experienced speakers addressing that subject with Sandy Ungar and myself. That's on the 20th of May at the same time as this, the 11 o'clock US, 4 o'clock UK time. Thanks again to Jane, also to my co-convener for the series, Joseph Simmons SJ at Campion Hall in Oxford. Thanks to all of you who've submitted questions. Also, I'd like to thank those at Georgetown University, especially, of course, as always, Yvonne Queck, without whom none of the technology would work. And I apologize from my point of view, it almost failed at one point during the session today. Special thanks to Professor Catherine Temple at Georgetown University for feeding questions to me. I'd like to thank Dr. Nick Austin, SJ, Master of Campion Hall, Sarah Gray and Ying Ying, our Campion Hall administrators at Blackfriars, Dr. Richard Finn, OP, Director of the Las Casas Institute, Dr. John O'Connor, the Regent, and Kinga Rona Gavanai, our UK administrator. At Georgetown, Our thanks, as ever, to Dr. Jack DeJoya, the President, and Dr. Tom Banchoff, the Vice President, Global Affairs, who support these events. Finally, my thanks to you for being in the audience today. Please join us again on the 20th of May and on the 1st of June. In the meantime, keep safe, take care. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter at MikeScottProf. Thank you. Thanks, Jane. Thank you and goodbye.